This video contains spoilers for episode 6 of Fionna and Cake. You have been warned. I know I said last video that episode 5 of Fionna and Cake Destiny could be a top 3 in the series, but this episode kinda leaves no debate. Episode 6 of Fionna and Cake, The Winter King, is by far one of the best in the series so far, but not only is it a great episode, it just feels like one of those episodes that you throw on around Christmas time every single year. Not only that, but there are a lot of secrets and hidden Easter eggs in this single episode. So let's talk about them. Starting off the episode, and we open to Fionna's world, which was totally absent in the last episode. And at this point, we've pretty much been knowing that her city is glitching out like crazy, but there's two things to note. First, the only two signs that we can see in the city are labeled sign. Clearly, it's a sign, but for what exactly? And then secondly, we see the ice crown, or at least the silhouette outline of the ice crown, which kind of reaffirms the whole idea that Fionna and Cake's world only exists inside Simon's head, which at this point is confirmed. And we see a tiny little snowflake falling, which is pretty big foreshadowing for what's to come. Still in Fionna's world, we now cut to Gary outside of her apartment knocking on the door, and he's pretty upset that she hasn't been texting him back, which makes sense because if we remember, Fionna's cake had zero service across the multiverse. But then he goes inside and assumes that she's been robbed because of just how messy it is, which is pretty funny because that's just the way she lives. And Marshall Lee confirms that by coming out of her bathroom shower, scaring Gary in the process. Remember, at this point, Gary and Marshall Lee have never met, so Gary is pretty freaked out when he expects Fionna to be in her apartment to be met by Marshall Lee. What's even cooler is Adam Muto stated that these episodes of introducing Gary and Marshall Lee to each other were meant to roughly represent and flesh out how Princess Bubblegum and Marceline met each other. So it's obviously not one-to-one, but how we see Marshall Lee and Gary throughout this episode would be pretty similar to how Princess Bubblegum and Marceline met. Then Gary asks Marshall Lee who he is, and Marshall Lee does the same. And that sparks the introduction between Gary and Marshall Lee. And throughout this episode, their interactions are only going to get better. Continuing on though, and we finally learn where Fionna, Cake, Simon, and the Scarab ended up teleporting after using Prismo's remote. And it's this fancy Ice Kingdom looking place, which we'll obviously see a lot more of very soon. But one thing to note, in the middle very right hand side of the screen, if you zoom in, there seems to be this chair with a gumball dispenser on it. Now I have no idea what this could mean or if it references anything, but if it does, please let me know. Sure enough, nothing changes and the Scarab continues to chase down Fionna, Cake, and Simon. However, in this new icy world, out of nowhere, they're saved, with an ice bolt freezing the Scarab in his tracks. But who saved them, you might ask? None other than the Winter King, who in this universe is Simon. Now, without thinking, because remember, their goal is to get their hands on an ice crown to give to Simon, Cake steals the Winter King's ice crown. But she quickly gets caught by two Ice Clops, who, if you didn't know, made their first appearance in the animated short, the very first episode of Adventure Time. But if you notice, there's one key detail that's different from the Ice Clops we see in the very first episode of Adventure Time and the Ice Clops we see here. They're hats. Thanks to Steve Wolfhard for posting his art on Twitter, the hats that the Ice Clops wear in this episode are meant to show that they are clean and uniformed, acting as Gumball Guardian proxies, which kind of gives us our first look at what exactly is going on in this alternate universe. Back to the Winter King though, and he doesn't take any offense for Cake trying to steal his crown. In fact, he's amused that the cat is named Cake and asks Fionna who she is. Then after Fionna introduces herself, she tells him that the reason they need his crown is to make Simon cursed and magical again in order to bring magic back to their world and protect it. Remember, that's been their game plan since the end of episode 4, when Simon drops that bombshell of him wanting to be the Ice King again. And we're starting to see how this plan plays out, each episode going from universe to universe looking for an ice crown. But the Winter King offers them a solution. Although they can't take his crown, he's got something in mind. Now, before they head off, Fionna tells the Winter King that she thinks she's been dreaming about him, and he says he's not surprised.
I'm radical.
Now, if you don't remember, this is from the very first episode. In fact, the very first sequence in that episode, when Fionna and Cake are in a dream sequence and a very similar thing happens to them. They get saved at the last minute by the Ice Prince, who looks pretty similar to the Winter King, but I think they're totally different people. Now let me explain. Going back to Steve Wolfhard's art that he posted on Twitter, we see for this exact episode, he drew the Winter King in the same model as the Ice Prince. But in the episode itself, we see that the Winter King has a totally different look compared to the Ice Prince. So I think at some point along the way, they decided to make the Ice Prince and the Winter King two totally separate people. And I think we'll even see the Ice Prince later down the line, because the Ice Prince that we see in Fiona's dream seems to have some sort of evil demeanor, which although we will see later in this episode that the Winter King isn't all as he seems, the Ice Prince had this weird grin to him, and I think we'll see him later down the line. Before we could get into that though, we cut to the title card, and just with this little jingle alone, you can tell that it just has that warm and fuzzy feeling that you play around Christmas time every single year. Going back to the episode though, the Winter King takes them inside his throne room, which looks amazing. Cool little thing to note here is that Fionna and Cake are obviously very cold, shivering, and I mean, who wouldn't be? The entire throne room is made out of ice, but Simon isn't. And this makes perfect sense because Simon was once the Ice King, and he probably got used to the cold. That's exactly why he doesn't shiver in this scene when Fionna and Cake do. But then Simon asks the question that's been on all of our minds. How is he, the Winter King, so functional if he's just another cursed Simon? Because remember, the Ice King never had this amount of functionability. He was always the shell of what Simon was. But this Ice King in this universe seems to have everything put together, which we see later down the line might not be the case. But the Winter King explains the best way he can, by breaking out in song. Among all the songs in Fionna and Cake, this one is great, so I definitely recommend you listen to it, but I'm gonna point out some of the things that we see during the song. Firstly, the animation style switches, and it's amazing. The animation was done by Small Boo Animation, which, if that sounds familiar, it's the same studio that made Batman Spider-Man. They've also worked on Adventure Time before, with their most notable one being the episode Beyond the Grotto. We also see the hot chocolate that was offered to Fionna and Cake to help warm them up, which, thanks to Steve Wolfhard again, we see that this may be connected to the Candy Tavern cocktail, the canned coffee, soups, etc., which again kind of shows us what's really going on in this universe. Then the Winter King recounts his history, being pretty much the same as Simon's, as we see him in the post-apocalyptic world with the crown, then with Marceline, then transforming into the Ice King, but not for long, as he said all it took was his sheer force of will to manifest his own reality. Now for the timeline purpose, this is important because he mentions that he did this around 100 years ago, which would explain what really happens at the end of this episode. But then he takes Simon throughout the world that he has created, and we see some familiar characters, but also some new ones, so let's talk about them. We see a snowing cloud person sitting on the roof. Then we see what looks like the gnome ruler from the episode Power Animal has tamed an ice version of the firewolf pup from the episode Thank You. Then this big guy right here, who doesn't fit on the screen with that Christmas sweater, appears to be a brachiosaurus, you know, the dinosaur with that super long neck. Then finally, this pink and green person sitting in the middle. Now this might be a little bit of a reach, but I think the pink person in the middle is an Easter egg that represents the character Clancy from the show The Midnight Gospel. Because if you didn't know, Pendleton Ward, the creator of Adventure Time, also made The Midnight Gospel, and they kind of look similar. Moving on though, and Simon is still confused on how the Winter King conquered the crown, and instead of explaining it, he just tells Simon that he'll show him how to do it after he duplicates his crown. That's the Winter King's big plan. He'll duplicate the ice crown that he already has now and give the duplicated one to Simon, and once Simon has this new duplicated crown, he'll show Simon how to really conquer the ice crown. The song has wrapped up by this point, and if you think the Winter King's voice sounds familiar, that's because he's voiced by Brian David Gilbert. Brian David Gilbert is a writer, actor, musician, and video producer who hosted the show Unraveled on the Polygon channel.
And I Either Sonic is a god or could kill God, and I do not care if there is a difference!
With that series having come to an end on December 28th of 2020, he now uploads, and I quote, songs and things to his personal channel. I didn't even recognize this at first, and I wondered why the Winter King sounded so familiar. And not only does Brian David Gilbert really play the part, but he also kind of looks like the Winter King. Overall, just such a perfect person to play this character. Now back to the episode, and before Simon could ask any more questions about overcoming the Ice Crown, Fionna asks a more important question, and that's if he tinkers with the original curse, then will she be able to fight in this new version, since she really got stomped in the last one. The Winter King then gives Fionna an ice sword and has some Ice Scouts attack to test her abilities before having them stand down. Now Fionna is absolutely amazed since she was able to defend herself better than she did before. But did you notice that little thing that happened? The thing I'm talking about is that little red flash before she starts fighting with this sword. Not only is that meant to represent evidence that while the Ice Prince appears completely sane, he still has an Ice King bug in his brain even he doesn't know about. But it's also meant to resemble the Ice King or Ice Thing himself. Again, thank you to Steve Wolfhard for posting all this on Twitter, and it wouldn't be possible without it. Fionna, with this newfound ability to fight, the Winter King asks Cake if there's anything that she wants, and all she asks him if she can charge Fionna's phone to 100%. But remember how I said in the very beginning that Fionna's phone did not have multiversal level capabilities? Well, not only does the Winter King charge the phone to 100%, but he gives the phone signal. So now this is a multiversal phone. Also, the appearance of this chicken without any feathers is just classic Adventure Time. A little creepy. But now that the phone has this new multiversal capability, she starts receiving all the texts that Gary has been sending, to which she then responds to Gary saying that she's okay, and the man in her apartment is probably Marshall Lee. And sure enough it is. Remember, this interaction between Gary and Marshall Lee is meant to not exactly mirror Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, but meant to represent how they first met. Continuing on, Gary's relieved that she's alright, but annoyed she's bailing on him again. Gary then heads out because he's got a bunch of chores and baking to do. Marshall Lee's curiosity kicks in and asks if Gary's the genius behind the tasty biscuits Fionna had. Remember, Gary's been working on those for a while, and it's part of his 64th step in opening his own bakery. He gave some of the test to Fionna, who ran into Marshall Lee, then Marshall Lee had a taste and was amazed by them. Gary pretty much says that, yeah, I made those. Then Marshall asks if there's any food where Gary's going, kind of already implying that he's coming with him. And sure enough, as they leave, Marshall tags along. Then out of nowhere, it turns out LSP was there the whole time. Now, Marshall Lee and LSP's friendship isn't just random. This was fleshed out all the way back in season 8 in the episode 5 Short Tables. You can just tell that they were such good friends in this episode, and it's so cool seeing that continue in Fionna and Cake. Now back in this Winter Kingdom, the Winter King says that it only take a week to duplicate the crown in his laboratory. He says in the meantime, they should feel free to partake in the pleasure of the Winter Kingdom. As Fionna and Cake look around though, Cake tells Fionna that they should check out a candy mountain since it looks gnarly, but the Winter King tells her no, because that place is forbidden. But he quickly corrects himself and says that it can be dangerous out there. We've already seen before, but now it's really starting to show. Something's off with this Winter King. Then the Winter King asks Simon to help him in the laboratory, some Ice Scouts ask Fionna to join them in their training sessions, and Fionna tells Cake to not move so she won't get lost. And with that, they all split up. Cake then decides that she's gonna spend some time outside of the throne room, but as she heads outside, she passes by a room with someone very familiar, an Ice young Marceline with her classic axe base. Now just from the way this looks, it looks like she's in some sort of prison, with those bars in front of her being some fancy prison bars. She does look happy though, with a smile on her face, so who knows. But we also see a potion on her nightstand. I'll explain more of what this could mean later in the episode because we get another look at her later. When Cake finally gets outside the throne room, she ends with the frozen Scarab and Cake's ice prison. Scarab now telepathically calls Cake and Fionna an abomination and disease and tells her he'll break free from his prison. This also just kind of goes to show how powerful the Winter King really is. I mean, the Scarab easily took out the Cairo Siphon, and even Prismo is pretty scared of him. But the Winter King takes him out like he's nothing. After that, though, we transition back to Fiona's world, and it's now snowing, and Marshall, Lee, and Gary are heading to the candy supply store. Now, if you notice pretty much all the graffiti here, it's pretty obvious that this world is falling apart, and these smaller details aren't really paid attention to. I mean, the graffiti here says Lorem Ipsum, which is just placeholder text. As they head inside, though, Gary tells the cashier, who represents the human version of Lord Monochromicorn, that he's there to pick up his order. But Lord Monochromicorn isn't the only character referenced here. There are some candies to the very right of Gary that represent the Ice Crown. Even more to the right, we see a gumball dispenser, which kind of looks like a gumball guardian. And then in the very top right, we see a character that looks like Brocco from the episode The Suitor. Anyway, Gary is all about this crazy rich cocoa powder they have. He even lets Marshall try some, and that's when Marshall realizes why Gary's pastry mention, fancy name for his biscuits, are so good. Like we said before, Gary shares that he's got this whole 64-step business plan to make his pastry dream a reality, and he's super pumped about potentially meeting these big shot food empire twins, the Lemon Carbs, who could basically make his bakery dreams come true. If you couldn't tell, the Lemon Carbs are the gender bent versions of the Lemon Grabs from Ooh, and it's kind of funny that they now own a food company, because in the episode All Your Fault, they literally starved using all the food that Princess Bubblegum gave them to turn them into people, not food. Marshall then mentions under his breath that his mom might have mentioned Lemon Carbs before, which kind of makes sense because we found out in episode 1 that Marshall Lee's mom is a landlord. However, Gary took this as him being bored, but in fact, Marshall's not bored at all. He's actually really impressed by how passionate Gary is, and before they leave, Gary gets his cocoa powder order, and you can see both of them blushing a little. This kind of just goes to show how much of a connection they had from the very start. Cutting back to the Winter Kingdom though, and we now see Simon's rocking a new suit that's pretty much the same as his old one. The Winter King introduces Simon to his lab, which from the get-go is very interesting because the Ice King wasn't really known for his scientifics, but we all know who was. Now, one thing to note here is that this logo of the skull that we see on one of his tables is the same logo that we see in Ice Marcy's room. The Winter King then starts the cloning of his crown, and Simon's just super curious and has a ton of questions. The first being if Betty's still around, and the Winter King's super casual, calling her the dead one that he hasn't thought of in ages, which, and rightly so, Simon's super shocked because Betty was their greatest love, and the Winter King just has forgotten about her, offering a solution that once Simon has control of the Ice Crown, that he can just make his own Ice Betty, which might explain why he has his own young Ice Marcy, even though he says himself that that's kind of unethical, but I'll explain all that a little later. Then, out of nowhere, alarms start going off, and this pink cloud shows up zapping the lab. When the smoke finally clears, there's this crazy person on banana guards. Simon thinks it's Princess Bubblegum, but nope, it's the Candy Queen, Winter King's personal nemesis. Can you start to see where things are going? What's different in this alternate universe? However, Winter King tries to stop her by using his ice powers, but realizes he's crownless, and the Candy Queen nabs him and Simon. So at this point, it's pretty obvious what's going on, but let me explain. So, you know how Princess Bubblegum and the Ice King are totally different, but kind of connected in the original Ooh universe? Well, in this reality, the Winter King is kind of like the PB of that world. They're both super smart, have science labs, and have their own successful kingdoms. Not only that, but the visuals match up too. The Candy Queen's place has a giant ice cream cone that echo the mountains in the Ice Kingdom, and pretty much all the Steve Wolfhard art that we have seen so far also shows this, with even the Winter Kingdom's Ice Scouts have similarities to the Banana Guards. And even though in this alternate universe the roles are swapped, which we will find out why later in the episode, we can still see hints of Princess Bubblegum shining through. For example, the pink cloud that she flies in on is ran by electricity generated from that treadmill. So we're starting to see original Princess Bubblegum shine through just a little bit. And like I said before, we'll understand why real soon. When we last left left off, the Candy Queen kidnapped the Winter King and Simon. As all of this is going down, Fionna and Cake see all of it. The Ice Scouts say it's no biggie and that it happens all the time, which again mirrors what Ice King did to Princess Bubblegum. They even tell Fionna if she helps out with her magic sword, they can rescue both Simon and the Winter King. Fionna is absolutely dumbfounded and is so ready for this action-packed mission. Just from these reactions alone, you can tell that this is all Fionna ever wanted, to live in a magical world and go on these adventures all the time. Now back in Fionna's world, we get this super cute montage of Marshall and Gary hanging out for the day. They shop at the marketplace, the very thing Fionna was supposed to do with Gary, then they grab some cappuccinos, then they finally end their day right outside Butler's Buttery Buns, waiting for Beatrice Butler, the bakery owner, to lock up for the night. But as Gary goes to hide his face from Beatrice Butler using a newspaper, look at some of the things inside the newspaper. First, we see a silhouette of what looks like the Winter King, or at least a version of Simon transforming into the Ice King. Again, this just hammers home the fact that everything in this world is directly created from Simon's mind, but what this proves even more is that everything Simon is currently experiencing at that point in time is directly showing in Fionna and Cake's world live. Because if this is a silhouette of the Winter King, he wouldn't have known what the Winter King looked like until now. And sure enough, here he is in that newspaper. Then we see Betty in the top right of the newspaper. And this actually isn't the first time we've seen Betty in a newspaper in Fionna and Cake's world. The very first time we saw her was in episode 1, Fiona Campbell, in the newspaper that Queenie holds. It in fact happens in a very similar situation, with Queenie hiding her face with a newspaper and Gary doing the same. After Beatrice Butler finally leaves though, they sneak into the bakery and Marshall is totally into it. However, Marshall doesn't go in right away and makes a mysterious phone call to someone who we'll meet very soon. Now, back in the Winter King's world, the Candy Queen kidnapped Simon and the Winter King and takes them to her mountain lair. They're all wrapped up in gum and stuck in this super sturdy prison. Then, similar to how the Winter King broke out in song, the Candy Queen does the same. Even the Candy Queen has a keyboard, just like the Ice King had, and uses it to sing her song. Again, just like I did before, I'm just going to point out some of the things that we see during this song. First of all, the Candy Queen's master plan is to put them in a blender, then bake them together at 350 degrees. Then there's some pretty cool throwbacks. This marriage scene that we see with the Candy Queen and the Winter King is pretty similar to what happened in that episode When Wedding Bells Thaw. Then the Candy Queen's eyes herself could be references from the glasses that her yak wore, that she used to ride as a kid in the episode Bonnabelle Bubblegum. At this point, the Candy Queen wraps up her song, and Simon actually thinks it's a pretty good song, but he thinks that she's talking metaphorically. But nah, she's dead serious, which freaks both him and the Winter King out. Winter King even admits that this is an escalated situation, even for the Candy Queen standards. We even see one of those mutated gingerbread men that Gary made, which pretty much perfectly transitions us into Fiona's world again, where we see Gary making these gingerbread man for Marshall. After testing them out, Marshall loves them, then suggests because they're so good, they're probably ready to show off to some big-time investors, like the lemon carbs. But Gary's not so convinced. He thinks the gingerbread men are still a work in progress, and he'd be super embarrassed to show them to the lemon carbs. So let's hope they don't show up. But it turns out they do. That mysterious phone call Marshall made earlier, well, it turns out he asked his mom to pull a few strings, and got the lemon carbs to show up to Butler's Buttery Buns to test out these gingerbread men. Gary is shocked and scared to see them here. But before we find out what happens, we cut back to the Winter King's world. Fionna, Cake, and the Ice Scouts are taking on Candy Queen's candy minions, who are actually just mutated candy citizens. Winter King is now desperately calling for help, but Simon thinks they should help the Candy Queen because he believes there's a good person in her. Contrasted to the Winter King's view, who's pretty much just like, nah man, let's just get rescued, and yells for the Ice Scouts to come save them. Now, this actually makes a whole lot of sense. Simon's experience with the Ice Crown gives him a unique lens through which to view the Candy Queen's situation. He's been where she is, trapped by forces that twisted him into someone he wasn't. He knows the despair of that kind of existence, but also the liberation of being freed from it. It's not just an intellectual understanding, it's deeply empathetic because he's lived it. On the other hand, the Winter King never got to experience that release. He overcame the crown's influence through sheer willpower, which is commendable, but fundamentally different. He's still under its sway, whether he admits it or not, and that makes his view viewpoint more skewed. He sees the situation as something to escape from, rather than an opportunity for redemption and healing like Simon does. So when Simon advocates for helping the Candy Queen, it comes from a place of deep personal understanding. He's been the bad guy who was really a good person twisted by external forces, and he's been the good guy freed from those forces. His perspective naturally extends that hope to the Candy Queen, while the Winter King, still enmeshed in a struggle, can't quite make that empathetic leap. So the reaction from the two of them totally makes sense. Now this is where we start switching between worlds pretty fast. Back in Fiona's world, Gary's got this big moment where he's pitching his pastry creations, pastry mention, to these high-rolling investors, the lemon carbs. They try the pastries and they think they taste good, but they're not into how they look, specifically the faces. Gary tries to defend himself by saying that these characters are part of something bigger, the kingdom, which gives his food a story. You can definitely see the parallels here. Even all the pastry mentioned on this cake are candy citizens. He then specifically mentions Chocoberry and Mr. Cupcake are married, which will end up being a little Easter egg he mentions at the very end of this episode. Gary then explains who Cinnamon Bun is to Lemon Carbs, explaining how he's got the biggest heart of them all, which then cuts to Fiona going absolutely wild on the mutated Cinnamon Bun, literally ripping out his big heart. Gary then introduces the Scampish Marshmallow Kids, which is a direct reference to the episode Scamps. Then he continues to talk about his pantry mention, with the coupled montage being Fionna and Cake eliminating their mutated counterparts. Gary's finished his pitch, and the Lemon Carbs hate it and just walk out. Poor Gary's left feeling totally crushed. But the Lemon Carbs reaction totally makes sense if you think about it. You remember the lemon grabs from the original show, right? Created by Princess Bubblegum, and man, they couldn't stand her or anything she was about. So when Gary comes in telling a story about his pastries being citizens of a kingdom, you can bet that the Lemon Carbs are gonna have some deja vu that they don't like it. Pretty much making Gary's pitch doomed from the start, if you think about it that way. Now, back in the Winter King's world, Fionna and Cake show up just in time to catch the Candy Queen about to toss Simon and the Winter King into some crazy mixing contraption. But remember, Simon thinks that the Candy Queen needs help and can be fixed, but the Winter King's not having it and he just says knock her out. Remember, this totally makes sense. Simon having gone through it and then being completely cured from the curse, and the Winter King having gone through it but overcoming it with sheer willpower and not being freed from the curse entirely. But Fiona decides to listen to the Winter King and kicks the Candy Queen down and frees the guys. She gives the Winter King his crown back and they share this kind of dreamy moment together, very similar to what happened with her and the Ice Prince, even calling the Winter King the Ice Prince. But remember, even though the Winter King looks pretty similar to the Ice Prince, I still think the Ice Prince is going to be someone different. At this point though, I could be totally wrong. However, during this dreamy moment that they had together, they share a kiss. Then all of a sudden, the crown loses its magic. The Winter King turns back into old Simon and literally crumbles to dust right in front of Fiona. Simon is also absolutely shocked because, I mean, who wouldn't, seeing your own self die like that right in front of you? And now get this, the entire Winter Kingdom starts to melt away. But if you remember, this whole taking the magic out of things isn't new to Fionna and Cake, specifically Cake. If you notice the way the Ice Crown loses its magic, it's the exact same way that Cake took the magic away from that hot dog night. Not only is this not new, but it gives us a little hint that Fionna and Cake could mess with other universes and strip away their magic. This might even give us some information about what's going to happen. If Fionna, Cake, and Simon were to actually find an Ice Crown and for Simon to actually put it back on, all Fionna or Cake would need to do is give the Ice Crown a little touch, and then Simon would go back to normal. But then that also technically destroys their world, so who knows what might happen. So you know how I said the Winter King's kingdom was melting due to his death? Well, that includes the young Ice Marceline. Not only is this scene just super sad, but it also throws a ton of questions in the air. Let me give you the explanation that PB gives on what really happened to her, and then we'll go back to this Marceline scene. Princess Bubblegum says that the Winter King didn't overcome due to sheer will. He casted a spell that projected all of the madness from the Ice Crown into Princess Bubblegum. So in the song from the very beginning, when he says that he overcame the crown 100 years ago, that wasn't true. It happened 100 years ago, but it's when he cast the spell to project all of the madness into Princess Bubblegum. But how does this explain the young Ice Marceline? Well, here's what I think. We know that Marceline and Princess Bubblegum are very close. So if the Ice King's plan was to project all of the madness from the crown into Princess Bubblegum, there is no way Marceline would let that happen. So although he didn't know it, I'm guessing the Ice King had to take care of Marceline in order to cast the spell on Princess Bubblegum. Then, after he casted the spell and quote-unquote overcame the madness of the Ice Crown, he realized what he had done. He had taken Marceline out of the picture. So, in an effort to try and make himself feel better for what he did, he created a young Ice Marceline to live with him forever. At least, that's what I think. And I could be totally wrong, so let me know what you think. However, now with Princess Bubblegum free from that madness, she wants to know where her candy people are. But Cake is quick to block the sad view of what's left of them. Because if you remember, Fionna and Cake had just been on a killing spree. She doesn't see them, however, and gives Fionna a big thank you for breaking the curse with a lollipop pin and a kiss on the cheek. But Fionna is still feeling down, thinking she's not a real knight. And remember, the Winter King's kingdom had just melted. And who was frozen in the very beginning of that episode? That's right, the Scarab. And just when you think things might calm down for Fionna and Cake, the Scarab shows up and basically tells Fionna her big mistake was existing in the first place. He tries to attack them, but they all manage to teleport out of that universe, leaving the Scarab angry and super frustrated. Now, cutting back to Fiona's world, Gary and Marshall are tidying up the bakery after what had just happened. Marshall says it's not all bad because at least the lemon carbs like the flavors of the pastry mentioned. He ultimately apologizes though for the sudden meeting, saying he thought he was helping Gary out. Gary, on the other hand, thinks it's good that they showed up when they did, because he would have been tweaking that pastry recipe forever otherwise. Marshall then gets curious about how a chocolate-dipped strawberry and a cupcake would ever meet, and Gary's a bit defensive at first, thinking Marshall is just making fun of him. But Marshall assures him that he's genuinely curious, so Gary opens up and shares that their unique love story began at a slumber party that turned into a candy zombie outbreak, which is a reference to the very first episode of Adventure Time that aired on Cartoon Network, titled Slumber Party Panic. Now, if you're wondering what universe Fionna, Cake, and Simon ended up in, we actually find out. They find themselves in a super weird universe where everyone's a baby version of themselves. A baby version of Ice King, Finn, Jake, Tree Trunks, Lady Rainicorn, Ricardio the Heart Guy, Magic Man, the Jiggler, and the Lich. Now, if you didn't know why the Lich is here, it pretty much confirms that he is in every single universe. In the episode crossover, his hand gets cut off and falls into every single universe in the multiverse. We even saw a Lich in the previous episode's Prisma the Wishmaster, in that cartoon-styled world. Now, at this point, I don't think the Lich will be a super important character in this series. I think he will just be a cool little Easter egg that they show in each universe they travel to. I could be super wrong, and I kind of hope I am because I love the Lich, but it just seems like that's the route that they're headed towards. But now, in this baby universe, Fiona's a bit down because she's thinking about the last universe where she thought she was living the dream, but ended up hurting all these innocent candy people. She's now worried that maybe she's been messing things up in every universe they visit. Simon reassures her, saying that the last place was off because that universe's Simon was messed up, not her, and that the next universe they go to will probably have the right crown and he'll be properly cursed again. They fist bump on that hopeful note, and baby Finn from that universe even joins in on the action, which pretty much confirms where we're going next, Marceline's universe that we saw in the trailer. Why do I say that? Well, we see a baby-looking Finn in the intro, running down the same street that we see Fionna, Cake, and Simon get into fights with the vampires from the trailer. Finally, we can put two and two together and figure out who this baby Finn in the intro is, and it turns out it is baby Finn, but from the alternate universe. Not only that, but we pretty much know how this baby universe was created. I forgot to mention two other characters that we see in this baby universe. The first one being Baby Cinnamon Bun, but the second one being that baby monitor in the background. Does it look familiar? If it does, that's because it's BMO. Steve Wolfhard, again, mentioned that this whole baby world was thought to be the result of BMO's wish to Prisma, although it didn't make it into the episode. And instead of being an adventurer, BMO got turned into a baby monitor. Now, if you know Fionna and Cake episodes, you would know that this episode isn't over. There's an Easter egg in every single credit scene for for each episode. And I think this episode is pretty straightforward. It pretty much just recounts everything they've been through in this episode and continues their journey to find the Ice Crown. But if you didn't know, I make deep dives and analyses into each episode of Fionna and Cake as soon as they come out. So if you don't want to miss episodes 7 and 8, make sure you subscribe. Also, if you like this video, make sure to like. But thank you all for watching, and as always, stay adventurous.